annals of history are stained crimson, saturated with the blood of men and women who went to great lengths, even to their own martyrdom, to protect and preserve the Word of God. Were they just zealots? Were they ignorant and backwards? Were they even religious? What are we missing on this topic? We begin our journey with this short expose on just one passage from Genesis that has indisputably been altered, and we will prove it and pose the question with our theory as to who changed Genesis. Hold on to your seat. By the way, the previous clip is from a promotional video for Museum of the Bible, which opens in Washington, D.C. in just days, November 17th, 2017. We haven't been there yet, of course, but this is funded by the owner of Hobby Lobby in the U.S., who has been boycotted and ridiculed for taking a stand on the Bible. Our opinion is it's worth seeing from what we can see, and many of us will in fact go. It is reported that they even have some of the original Dead Sea Scroll fragments, which would be awesome to see. We don't mind giving them a plug, so there you go. Welcome to the God Culture, where we urge you to challenge traditions, as 1 Thessalonians 5:21 says, "Prove all things, hold fast that which is good." This series will do exactly that. We will expose the misleading narratives we have been taught and work to restore the intentions, character, and purpose of these men, and the word they worked so hard to protect. Why does this matter? Paul lays this out for us in 2 Corinthians 2:8. "Beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Messiah Christ." And Jesus said to the Pharisees, "Full well ye reject the commandment of God, that ye may keep your own tradition." Mark 7:9. Do you know what the tradition of the Pharisees was and is today? Has it been Christianized, or does it still oppose the commandments of God, Yahuwah, today? You know, the answer to that question, but notice, no one ever asked that one. It's taboo. You are not allowed to go there because we will. During this Solomon's Gold series, we uncovered something we didn't even initially realize. It was one of our viewers that pointed this out, and recently we went back and took a good look at it. He challenged us when we said Jubilees may have been altered because it didn't match Genesis, and he said would we be willing to consider the possibility that Genesis was actually the text that had been altered instead. Well, we have no issue challenging tradition, but when we research this, you will never guess what we found. Genesis was the one that was changed, and we will prove it in this video. So what does it matter? So Genesis may have been changed. Who cares? This is a short introduction to our next series, where we will prove that this may actually be among the most important topics of our day. And today we have the knowledge to deal with this. For instance, it's not just Genesis. They removed the very name of Yahuwah, God, YHWH, about 7,000 times in modern Bibles, as well as changing the name of Yahusha, Jesus. We will address that in this series as well. It's bad enough that this was done, but what's worse is that it is still not being corrected, even though we know better. Not we all know better. These things are well known to scholars. Did you know why? Do you know who did this? We will prove it, starting with this introduction video, and there will be definite proofs here, but continuing into our original canon series, coming later this week perhaps, which is going to prove that there is a more ancient canon than what we are being told. Wow. The canon is the books of the Bible selected initially by the Catholic Church, which completely ignores the possibility of one prior, especially one of the Old Testament, but just whose canon is right. The Catholic Church, the Protestants, the Ethiopian Church, the Pharisees, and what about this sect we hear so much about, the Essenes, who supposedly lived in Qumran, Israel in the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls? We will prove indisputably in our next video series that the Essenes did not live in Qumran, but we will show you in history and by the Bible where they did live. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were uncovered, the church quickly moved to suppress them. And it took 50 years to release most of the books. We personally have heard from the pulpit that they contain Gnostic Gospels. Just so you know, that is a lie. There was not one Gnostic Gospel found with the Dead Sea Scrolls. In fact, they were found in Egypt. That's a different find altogether. But 65 of the 66 books of the Bible were there, including the oldest known versions of especially Isaiah, a complete scroll over 20 feet in length, preserved. We heard that a twisted cult, the Essenes, were responsible for them. No, they were not. And that we don't have to bother with them because they are not inspired or canon. So even once they were released, they are suppressed in plain sight by the scary language that accompanies the Dead Sea Scrolls. We should have funny music that plays there, horror music, in which they are associated. But you can read them if you dare. Of course, it will damn your soul to hell, of course, according to church doctrine. That's nonsense. Your eternity hangs in the balance, but a pastor can quote Pythagoras or Plato, and that's acceptable. They were Satanists, occultists, Kabbalists. We saw this immediately when we used the Book of Jubilees and Enoch as historical references to find the garden. We didn't necessarily use them as inspired text. We use them as geographic data, which they are good for. They are historical documents. Yet they do find the garden, don't they? And you've seen they do. We have a massive problem with these scare tactics like those which are meant to keep us away from even looking. Like the one with Revelation and prophecy that, oh, you're adding to Revelation by interpreting what it says. No, that's not adding to anything. That's simply trying to interpret it. And you know what? All of us are allowed to do that. That is not something that only scholars can do. Not from any of our viewers who were sincerely asking these questions, though. We are talking about the seminaries who set the tone for these kinds of conversations, especially shutting down some of them, many of them. And just why does that matter? Because we are going to prove from the Bible, ancient maps, and history that the person who lived in Qumran with his disciples was the voice crying in the wilderness himself. Sound crazy? Watch this next video and see if we prove it. We believe we do. So, let's get started with what we found in Genesis. Genesis 10:22 through 24. The children of Shem, Elam, and Asher, and Arphaxad, and Lud, and Aram. And the children of Aram, Uz, and Hol, and Gether, and Mash. And Arphaxad begot Selah, and Selah begot Eber. Oh no, not the table of nations. All these years, we have either seen pastors shy away from the table of nations, or they many times mention it in a very boring way. That is not even true, though. Did you realize we have learned more revelation from the table of nations than we had ever dreamed? Check out our Solomon's Gold series if you have not, and follow in restoring biblical geography all the way back to the very location of the land of creation, the Garden of Eden, and the rivers from Eden. Again, we know that's a big claim. But if you haven't watched those 20 or so videos, you are missing exact directions, which we found from Noah himself as well as the Bible. By the way, the NIV, NLT, ESV, NASB, Amplified, Complete Jewish Bible, Orthodox Jewish Bible, Jesuit Bible, Wycliffe Bible, Catholic Bible, and more all read this very same way. So Shem had a son named Arphaxad who fathered Selah, who fathered Eber. Big deal, right? Wait till you see this. You are looking at a verse that has been altered, and we will show you. And why? Problem is, this is different from the genealogy of Yahusha, Jesus, from Luke, which was the son of Saruk, which was the son of Ragu, which was the son of Phelek, which was the son of Eber, same guy, which was the son of Selah, which was the son of Canaan, Canaan. Now, that's not to be confused with Canaan, the son of Ham, who stole the land, later to become Israel, in which that land was named. Which was the son of Arphaxad, which was the son of Shem, which was the son of Noah, which was the son of Lamech. Now, seems boring, but there's quite a point here. This is backwards in order from Genesis, but it says that Arphaxad had a son named Canaan, who fathered Selah. Wait, didn't we just read that Arphaxad fathered Selah without Canaan mentioned in the text of Genesis at all? It's missing completely. So, is this left out in Genesis, or was it added in Luke? Because both cannot be correct. If it were just multiple sons, that would be one thing, but this is a clear case of Canaan, completely missing from Genesis, but not in Luke. But we can figure out exactly which is accurate and which was altered. Genesis 10:22 through 24 in the Brenton translation of the Septuagint, which is the Greek interpretation of the Old Testament writing, similar to the manner of the King James with several scholars 300 years before Yahusha or so. It says, sons of Shem, Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, and Lud, and Aram, and Canaan, and sons of Aram, Uz, and Ol, and Gader, and Mosach. And Arphaxad begot Canaan, and Canaan begot Selah. So Arphaxad didn't beget Selah according to the Septuagint, and Selah begot Eber. So, 2 against 1. Luke and even the Septuagint mention Canaan, who is missing from Genesis. Nothing to see here, right? There's more. Here's the passage we reviewed during the Garden of Eden segment, Jubilees 8:1. In the 29th Jubilee in the first week, in the beginning thereof, Arphaxad took to himself a wife, and her name was Rasujah, the daughter of Susan, the daughter of Elam, and she bare him a son in the 3rd year in this week, and he called his name Canaan. So, 3 against 1. In other words, Genesis is wrong here. Did we say that? Yes, we did, because it's wrong. There is no other way to look at it. Does it matter, though? Wait till you see who Canaan is. But let's continue, because this explains, it's Arphaxad, Canaan, and in the 13th Jubilee, in the second week, in the first year thereof, he took to himself a wife, and her name was Milcah, the daughter of Madai, the son of Japheth. And in the 4th year, he begot a son, and called his name Shelah. For he said, truly I have been sent. So it's Shem, Arphaxad, Canaan, Selah, then Eber, who fathered Peleg, the father of the Israelites, and Joktan, the father of the land of the east, the far east, the land of the Garden of Eden, and creation at the ends of the earth. Yep, we proved that. Watch our Solomon's Gold series if you have not. And yes, it matters where the garden is, because it is the holy of holies of Yahuwah God on earth, the permanent one, the most significant place on earth. That matters. So just who is Canaan? Why would someone remove him from Genesis? Did Moses not know who he was? Well, nonsense. Of course, Moses would know his genealogy, as he knew of a coming Messiah. And in fact, Genesis was basically given to him on Mount Sinai. He would know his genealogy, and he would know about the coming Messiah and the bloodline from which he came, or was to come at that point. So an ancestor of Jesus, Yahushua, was recorded in Luke, the Septuagint version of Genesis, and Jubilees, but was deleted from Genesis at some point, at least in all modern versions, as even the 1611 King James and the 1599 Geneva Bible have it wrong. Why? You'll see. Thank Yahuwah God for the book of Jubilees, which tells us why, continued from the previous slide. And the son, Canaan, grew, and his father taught him writing, and he went to seek for himself a place where he might seize for himself a city. And he found a writing which former generations had carved on the rock. And he read what was thereon, and he transcribed it, and sinned, owning to it. So even owning this doctrine was sin. How about that? For it contained the teaching of the watchers, in accordance with which they observed the omens, demons, of the sun and moon and stars in all the signs of heaven. And he wrote it down and said nothing regarding it, for he was afraid to speak to Noah about it, lest he should be angry with him on account of it. So Canaan found the doctrines of the watcher fallen angels carved on a rock, who were re-educating and destroying Yahuwah God's creation before the flood, and they were imprisoned because of it in the earth. But notice his actions here. He writes them down, keeps them, and hides them from Noah, because Noah would be angry with him for doing so. How would he know this? Because Canaan knew the story of the flood directly from Noah and Shem, which we cover in our flood series. See, they survived through several of their generations. He knew what this doctrine was and where it came from, or he would not have known to hide it from Noah. But he desired that esoteric knowledge, didn't he? And we see this play out in Babylon when the watcher doctrine becomes reconstituted. What was this doctrine? It was the teaching of astrology, according to this passage, to observe the stars, sun, and moon through the lens of the watchers, not Yahuwah God. Big difference. Did you know that is still happening today? Canaan's spirit is evident in things like the September 23rd prophecy, where Bible prophecy is inaccurately interpreted using astrology, not astronomy. That's astrology, which is the study of the stars, would be astronomy. That's a good thing, which even Adam observed, and that is scriptural. And yes, they are there for a sign, but astrology, where the stars are cataloged into shapes which the dots could be connected trillions of ways, that form pagan gods who just so happen to be the Watcher fallen angels and their offspring. Perhaps that's not so wise either. What is this doctrine? We will prove it out in a complete video, but it is Kabbalah, the religion of ancient Babylon. Wait, K&M found an older document than portions of the Bible, so it must be more true than the Bible, right? Wrong. That's nonsense. That's stupid scholarly thinking based on a false narrative in the first place. Even to ask that question makes no sense. Older things are not necessarily better. Just as newer technology sometimes can create more problems than they are worth. Why was this changed? We believe it was to eliminate K&M from the lineage because he is the root of Kabbalah after the flood. Kabbalah is the esoteric form of what they call Judaism, a word which is never mentioned in the Bible, by the way. Judaism. It's not there in any of it. Not the extra biblical books, not the any of it. So why isn't it there? You should ask yourself that question and research that. Kabbalah is the Watcher fallen angel doctrine, and we will prove that out further. So, some translator, but who, omitted the founder of the Watcher doctrine, Kabbalah, after the flood. Why? Because they do not wish us to trace them back that far, and especially not tie them to the Watcher fallen angels, whom they have also worked to scrub out of the Bible. But it's still there in Genesis 6, so it's not going to be one of the scriptures we cover in this short series. Despite the attempted seminary claim that B'nai Ha-Elohim, the actual Hebrew sons of God in Genesis 6, means sons of Seth according to seminaries. That's inconsistent with its usage everywhere else in the Bible, because those were angels, not men. Otherwise, they couldn't mix their seed. Doesn't make any sense. It's all nonsense to look at it as sons of Seth. Seth was not a son of God. He was a son of Adam. Adam was a son of God. You could make that case, yes. He was created directly. He was not birthed. We'll cover that more in the Flood series as well. We also uncovered in Solomon's Gold series another verse in Genesis, which we're going to cover in the next video, which has also been altered in modern translations. And who espoused the Watcher doctrine with his descendants, even offering up their daughters to marry them, to bear Nephilim children initially before the flood? Well, do you know where that all started? We're going to prove this out further in the Flood series. It started with the lineage of Cain. Is there a connection here? Let's look at the name. K&M. Yes, we're using the spelling from Jubilees because we believe, and we're going to prove in the Dead Sea Scrolls series, that Jubilees actually was written around the same time as Genesis. Ooh, how dare we. What heretics we must be. Well, call us whatever you want. We're going to prove it. And you're welcome to prove us wrong if you think you can. K&M. Cain is obvious, the son of Adam, who turned evil along with his generations. He's the founder of the concept of the city, the great society, right? We see that today. The city spirit that comes out. You know, I live in Manhattan. I live in New York. I live, I love New York. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, you go and you love New York. You go love Cain's structure of his city all you want. I'm going to love Yahuwah God. That matters far more. We play these games and we get sucked into it with colleges and classes, this class versus this class as if one year is better than another. Of course it's not. That's ridiculous. That makes no sense. Perhaps one ends up achieving more, but that has nothing to do with anything. And you especially don't know that when you're in high school. Anyway, the same one we use today as we try to build the great society. But was that the way of Adam, Enoch, Noah, Abraham? No. Remember, many of the patriarchs were named defining their prophetic destiny. The Hebrew word am, Canaan, means people. So this would mean people of Cain? No. Now this is after the flood, and Canaan is not the lineage of Cain, which we've seen he's from Arphaxad in the line of Yahushua, Jesus, according to Luke, right? So Canaan founded the people of Cain's religion, which is the religion of the Watcher, fallen angels. Cain worked with them, which we call modern Kabbalah, and we'll prove that. And we will get to proving that in the next series. Let's consider this on a timeline to make sense of it. In the 3rd century BC, the Septuagint renders Genesis 10:22 through 24 to include Canaan, as son of Arphaxad and father of Selah. In the 2nd century BC, we still find Canaan in the book of Jubilees, though it was likely originally written far before that period. But we'll go with what scholars claim as the date, as it is at least 200 BC, indisputably. We will address Jubilees in an entire video coming very soon in the next series. But same as the Septuagint. Even Luke, no later than 84 AD when he died, according to records. Obviously, it could be disputed, and maybe it was a few years before or after, but it's that period, okay? It includes Canaan. By the way, it's not spelled the same as Canaan, Ham's son, just to be clear. In the genealogy of Yahushua, Jesus, which proves, by the way, that it was someone who only followed the Old Testament who made the change. Think about that. Who could that be? We'll prove it out. We know that the 1599 original Geneva Bible and the original 1611 King James and even the Jesuit Douay-Rheims 1899 Bibles already have the change recorded, and Canaan is wiped out of history in these Bibles. He's been removed from Genesis completely in modern versions. Just who and why? We'll get there, but we have established thus far it was changed before 84 AD when Luke died, and 1599 AD, the Geneva Bible. But let's vet this further. The oldest complete manuscript of the Hebrew Bible is known as the Leningrad Codex. Now, that's the Old Testament. When we say Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament was in Hebrew. The New Testament was written in Greek, at least in what we have. Obviously, there are Aramaic versions, but scholars believe it was originally written in Greek. There is a very compelling argument that it could have been written in Hebrew or Aramaic first and then translated into the Greek. Maybe, perhaps. We have no evidence of that, really. That's a linguistic thing, and we can't prove that. So, basically, the Leningrad Codex is the Masoretic text, and it dates 1008 AD. And guess what? The change is there too. Canaan is missing in Genesis 10. So now we know it was changed between 84 AD and 1008 AD. In 900 AD, the Masoretic text was formed, and this is recognized as the authority in manuscripts by most today. And Canaan is already missing in 900 AD as well. Now we know it was removed between 84 AD and 900 AD. Wikipedia even says the post-diluvian, that means after the flood, Canaan doesn't appear in the Hebrew Masoretic text of Genesis, where Arphaxad is noted as the father of Selah. He is also omitted from the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus in 94 AD, the early Christian writers Irenaeus in 130 AD, and Eusebius of Caesarea in 263 AD. Believed his presence to be an error mainly on the basis of his omission from the Masoretic Hebrew version, and many subsequent interpreters followed this. Well, they're wrong, and we've just proved that is not true. However, Helen Jacobus has argued that the omission from the Masoretic text is deliberate, and yes, it was. And she says, here's her writing, "It is likely that the Genesis 5 and Genesis 11 chronogenealogies can be dated to between the compilation of the LXX, which is the Septuagint Genesis, in the 3rd century BC, and the schism between the Samaritans and the Jews in the 2nd century BCE. So Jacobus nails it down to a period of between the 3rd century BC and the 2nd century AD, about 500 years. But she's missing Jubilees and Luke because she does not read those, of course. But now we have 3 scholars who removed Canaan from their writings, and they address this as well based on something, and they wrote in 94, 130, and 264 AD. What are they repeating? Because they are repeating something. Let's add this to our timeline. Oh, look, this change was made after 84 AD and before 94 AD. That's a 10-year period. Boy, that narrows it down pretty well, right? Did something occur in history during that time? Yes, it did. There are many claims that a council of Pharisees will show you there was no one else left in leading factions in Judea by that point. The Council of Jamnia, presumably held in Yavna, Jamnia, in the Holy Land, Israel, was a hypothetical, says the writer, of course, late 1st century council at which the canon of the Hebrew Bible, that'd be the Old Testament, was in Hebrew, the New Testament's the Greek, although there are certainly arguments out there that are very compelling that the New Testament may possibly have been written in Hebrew or Aramaic and translated in some cases. But we're not going to get into that. Was formerly believed to have been finalized, and which may also have been the occasion when the Jewish authorities decided to exclude believers in Jesus as the Messiah from synagogue attendance as referenced by interpretations of John 9:22 in the New Testament. Interpretations? Well, we'll discuss that. The writing of the Birkat HaMinim benediction is attributed to Shemuel HaKatan at the supposed Council of Jamnia. So now we have a writing that came out of the council that may not have come out of the council. They just confuse you all the time, don't they? Just what writing is that? We'll cover that in a moment. But first, here's John 9:22, since it's mentioned, and is it theoretical? Let's read. These words spake his parents, because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was Christ, with Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. Is that not clear? No. Of course it's clear. Yeah, it definitely says one would be kicked out of the temple for following Yahusha as Messiah. So that is fact, not an interpretation, right? And probably the rest of this is the same. And this was before Gemnia's council, which shows evidence of the atmosphere leading up to that point. And there's lots of evidence regarding that. Funny how they marginalize especially the New Testament. That's because they are the same that changed Genesis, and we'll show you. So this hypothetical council met, maybe, and might have discussed what to include or not include in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Are there notes we can review? No. Why not? Because they do not want us to know what actually happened at this meeting, nor that it even took place, evidently because it's hypothetical, right? Well, we cannot prove it took place either, though the date miraculously falls within our 10-year period, 90 AD, which is between 84 and 94 AD, miraculously, in which we have identified Genesis was changed. That means the Torah was changed. Not the New Testament, the Torah. Could it have been changed by the very ones who claim to protect it? We must vet this further. The Birkat HaMinim by Shemuel HaKatan at the Council of Gemnia, the hypothetical council, of course, wrote, this blessing, no, curse, for the apostates, let there be no hope, and let the arrogant government be speedily uprooted in our days. Let the Nazarim and the Manim be destroyed in a moment, and let them be blotted out of the book of life, and not be inscribed together with the righteous. Blessed art thou, O Lord, who humblest the arrogant. What an arrogant saying. But anyway, look at this. Are they talking about Christians here, or early believers, earlier followers of Yahusha? Could they be talking about someone else? Well, Nazarene, which is what they called themselves, sure do seem awfully similar. But let's see at least what scholars have to say about it. Modern scholarship has generally evaluated that the Birkat HaMinim probably of course, did originally include Jewish Christians before Christianity became markedly a Gentile religion. It is the 12th of the 18th benedictions, or Amidah. For those that are Messianics, you probably are familiar with the Amidah because it is recited in Messianic congregations, at least portions of it, certainly not this portion, I would imagine. In fact, it may not even be in your particular Seder, but who knows? Anyway, the point to this is, as much as this could be outrageous and enraging for that matter, forget that. Remember, this is a people at war, and obviously they're talking very, very large. Obviously, the two other opponents of the Pharisees have been eliminated at this point. By whom? We don't know. We can't prove that it was the Romans, but we also can't prove that it was the Pharisees, so we're going to leave it at that for this video. But what we do know is that this is a writing that came out of that very hypothetical council. The writing doesn't look hypothetical, it looks like it's real. And so there is a writing that we can go by. And what does it talk about? It talks about blotting out these people's names from the book of life. What else did they blot out? And what other names were they willing to blot out? Were they perhaps willing to blot out the name Canaan from the genealogy in Genesis? Because it sure does look like it to us. The temple in the city of David, not Jerusalem, according to the Bible anyway, was destroyed in 70 AD. But let's look into the story a little from the Jewish Virtual Library. At the beginning of the Common Era, 0 AD, a new group arose among the Jews, the Zealots, in Hebrew, Kanaim. Looks familiar. These anti-Roman rebels were active for more than 6 decades, 60 years, and later instigated the Great Revolt, the one that led to the destruction of the temple, of course. Their most basic belief was that all means were justified to attain political and religious liberty. Sound familiar? The ends justify the means? Well, that's because it is. That's Jesuit language. Odd. We'll deal with that later. This group of zealots already existed in the time of Yahushua, Jesus, and we know this because Barabbas, who was freed by the Pharisees over Yahushua, Jesus, was so because he was one of their sect, leading to war, which they will lead themselves in time. They weren't just not choosing Yahushua, they were choosing an ally of theirs. What was the sect called? The Canaim. That sounds awfully similar to Canaan, doesn't it? And the unaccounted Essenes we have heard so much about, which are never mentioned by name in the Bible, were among the rebels as well, even though Josephus says they did not war, yet they did. They were known as descendants from ancient times. Were they the descendants, the followers of Canaan, who brought Kabbalah back from Babylon to Israel? We will prove that further, and we believe they were. They were not present in Qumran, and no evidence points to that, and we'll show you. They were not there. And then it says liberty. Is that not the same cry today? Whole countries liberated at the cost of millions of their own lives. See, history merely repeats. How do we know who led this? From My Jewish Learning, I quote, "The Babylonian Talmud relates the dramatic story of Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai's escape from the Roman siege of Jerusalem in the year 70 CE AD. Before the Romans breach the walls of the city, Ben Zakkai abandons the spiritual and governmental capital of the Judean state." Well, that's mighty brave of him. "Even while the temple is still standing." Oh, really brave of him. So he left the temple not guarded. Good job. He foresees the fall of Jerusalem, and so he has himself smuggled out of the city in a coffin. Wow, that's so chivalrous. Through flattery and by humbling himself before the Roman general, he is able to negotiate a deal allowing him to establish a new center of learning in the city of Yavna. Where's that? Jamnia. The story of the founding of Yavna, Jamnia, represents the birth of Rabbinic Judaism. So this is where Rabbinic Judaism started. Now, Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai was one of the Tanim, an important Jewish sage in the era of the Second Temple, and a primary contributor to the core text of Rabbinical Judaism, the Mishnah. He was the first Jewish sage attributed the title of rabbi in the Mishnah. His students returned to Yavna, Jamnia, upon his death, and he was buried in the city of Tiberias. 11 centuries later, Maimonides was buried nearby. In his role as leader of the Jewish council, so he led a Jewish council, which one? Jamnia. He was succeeded by Gamliel II. So this guy was practically one of the founders, probably the founder, of modern Judaism. But why do they still fail to mention he was a Pharisee? Rabbi, how come it does not tell us who he was? Because they conceal that. But no problem, it's easy to figure out who was in charge in 70 AD and after. There were 4 factions. We had the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and Yahusha's followers. First, the Pharisees, according to Jewish Virtual Library. The most important of the 3 were the Pharisees because they are the spiritual fathers of modern Judaism. So he was a Pharisee then. Their main distinguishing characteristic was a belief in an oral law. That'd be the Babylonian Talmud, and we'll cover that. That God gave to Moses at Sinai along with the Torah. A secret doctrine, the source of secret societies and hidden knowledge? Yes, we believe so. But check out this next part. The Torah, or written law, was akin to the U.S. Constitution in the sense that it set down a series of laws that were open to interpretation. The Pharisees believed that God also gave Moses the knowledge of what these laws meant and how they should be applied. This oral tradition was codified and written down roughly 3 centuries later in what is known as the Talmud. So, we have always been told the U.S. Constitution is based on the 10 Commandments, but that isn't even half the truth, is it? Its root is the Talmud, which originated in Babylon. Starting to see a little clearer now? Check this out for a further connection. The U.S. declared independence on July 4th, 1776. On the Hebrew calendar, followed by the Pharisees, that would be the 17th of Tammuz. Now this is fascinating. I know, how dare us find this kind of stuff, but you got to see this. Let us forget for a moment that the month of Tammuz is never called such in all of Scripture. There is no month called Tammuz in any of Scripture. Tammuz was a pagan god from Babylon, and his name never appeared on the ancient Hebrew calendar ever, not before the Pharisees, other than perhaps a cult. But who put his name there? The same who we are exposing in this video. But look at why Tammuz 17, the day in which the U.S. was founded, is so important. 5 great catastrophes occurred in Jewish history on the 17th of Tammuz. Moses broke the tablets at Mount Sinai in response to the sin of the golden calf. Did you know who the golden calf symbolizes? Which is why Moses destroyed it? Why, Tammuz, of course. Tammuz of Babylon. That's who. A.K.A. Molech or Moloch. And the very month was named such. By whom? So this starts a 3-week period of fasting in sadness. For the 10 Commandments being broken? No. They continued and have withstood the test of time. They're still in place. No problem with the 10 Commandments and nothing to mourn. That's ridiculous. The only one to grieve for is the calf, which we find in Jeremiah. A woman at the gate was mourning, as well as 72 ancient elders at the doorway of the temple who were facing the east, worshiping Tammuz, mourning for him on that day. Wonder who they were. So, isn't that odd? We believe so. The daily offerings in the first temple were suspended during the siege of Jerusalem after the Kohanim could no longer obtain animals. Jerusalem's walls were breached prior to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE on this same day. Prior to the Great Revolt, the Roman general Apostomus burned a Torah scroll, setting a precedent for the horrifying burning of Jewish books throughout the centuries. An adulterous image was placed in the sanctuary of the Holy Temple, a brazen act of blasphemy and desecration. Were the Romans really that particular about Jewish dates? Not that history shows. It's quite a coincidence. This date carries a lot of weight, and it is the exact date they chose to found the U.S. That's as far as we'll go in this video, as far as that topic is concerned, but worth looking into further. So we established the Pharisees were in power at that time still, and today. But what about the other two factions, and really three? The Sadducees disappeared around 70 AD after the destruction of the Second Temple. None of the writings of the Sadducees has survived. Really? None? How could that be for a people trying to preserve their heritage? Shame on them. So, the little we know about them comes from their Pharisaic opponents. Their enemies? Yep. These two parties served in the Great Sanhedrin, a kind of Jewish Supreme Court made up of 71 members whose responsibility was to interpret civil and religious laws. As of 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed, so were the opponents of the Pharisees. Odd. Did the Romans kill them? Not according to history, as they supported the Romans over the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the ones who revolted and were militaristic over the Romans. So, not the Sadducees. So, who killed the Sadducees? We don't know. We don't know what happened to them. No one seems to know, but we do know something seems suspicious there. And that's all we'll say. Next is the Essenes. Josephus discussed the plight of the Essenes, who committed suicide at Masada, which is by the Dead Sea, nowhere near the Dead Sea Scrolls, by the way, long, long ways from there, and we'll prove all that out. In 68 AD, so just before the temple was destroyed, they committed suicide. So, they're gone. So, little at all is known about the Essenes, who were not even significant enough to be mentioned in the Bible. They were from an ancient lineage, but no one knows which. Some assume Zadok, the priest of the temple, but they are also trying to read the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they attribute those writings to them, which is flat out wrong. And we will put a nail in that coffin for sure with what we have found. Regardless, what we know at this point is that both of the opposing parties to the Pharisees in the Sanhedrin were gone by 70 AD. So who was in charge? Well, the Pharisees were. And when did Genesis get changed? Under their watch. It doesn't matter whether anyone can ever prove what was discussed and decided at the Council of Jamnia, which information is controlled by the very Pharisees, which might implicate themselves. The Pharisees were responsible for preserving the Old Testament, and instead they seized the opportunity and changed it. Perhaps they just allowed it to be changed, but again, that's the same thing because they continue to use it today, corrupted and defiled. You say, this is just one change, one name. No, there's more, which is why we have expanded this video into 3. In the next one, we will deal with who and when Hiddekel and Parat, the rivers from Eden, got changed. And in the third, we are going to deal with the big one, the largest and most important by far, the removal of the sacred name of Yahuwah God, which was there up until this time that we're discussing. And it was also pronounced prior to the Pharisaic rule. We are even going to show you references from translators who admit they replaced YHWH with Lord, right there in their very words. Yes, from their own writings. Wait a minute, aren't we forgetting the early followers of the Messiah, though? Just where were these disciples at this point? They were running for their lives, or already martyred. These are the plights of the first wave of the disciples from a quick internet search. Not all of these methods are proven, especially since some stories conflict between, well, beheading or crucifixion or whatever. But that doesn't matter. They were murdered for their faith. They were martyred, and it matters not how. You can see from 44 AD to 90 AD, the early leaders of that move of Yahusha were pretty much all murdered, except John, who was exiled after they tried to kill him, boiling him in oil, but he survived. The point of this, though, is by 90 AD, the Council of Jamnia, none of the early believers were around to protest. Pause the screen if you have not read this, if you wish to review all the different demise of the disciples. So who done it? It wasn't the butler in the kitchen with a candlestick. That's from the game Clue if you don't know what we're talking about. It's all right there in writing. 3rd and 2nd century BC. It's there, even Luke mentions it, by 84 AD. Canaan was there. Josephus begins propagating the deletion of Canaan in 94 AD. Josephus was a Pharisee, and we'll prove that further. The corruption appears in the Masoretic text in 900 AD and 1000 AD in the Leningrad Codex, as well as the 1599 Geneva Bible, 1611 King James, and 1899 Jesuit Bible, because the change was made long before. It was indisputably the Pharisees which made this corruption, and others we will cover. And why? Because Kainim is the origin of the Watcher fallen angel doctrine after the flood, which bears a striking resemblance to Kabbalah. Yes, Jewish Kabbalah, Babylonian Kabbalah, which permeates the Pharisee thought today, and always did, because they returned from Babylon with it. That's why we have evolving constitutions and ever-growing laws today. That is not Yahuwah God's system, but that of Babylon, originating from the Watchers before the flood. Canaan is the origin after the flood, though, and for all this time, they, the Pharisees, successfully hid that, but no longer. We'll prove that out, so don't try to debate us yet. Give us a chance to create our next videos. Now, in our next video, we are going to explore the change to the rivers from Eden, and then the very name of Yahuwah God, YHWH, which they removed 7,000 times from the Bible, and in Genesis alone 139 times. Who removed these things and why? At the same time, we are completing our first video in our next series, which will really blow your mind like you would not believe. Who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? Whose library was it? We are going to lay out a very strong case that it was the voice crying in the wilderness, meaning these aren't the work of some ancient weird cult, the Essenes, but the great prophet who preceded Yahushua Jesus himself, John the Baptist. Is this possible? Are we sure? Can we be so bold and make such a claim? We are 100% on this, just as we are that Ophir, Sheba, Tarshish, Havilah, the Garden of Eden, and the land of creation are all the modern-day Philippines. You are going to love this. Thank you for watching our Solomon's Gold series. Make sure you are notified by YouTube as we upload new videos by clicking the subscribe button below this video. Share this with others and check out our website at thegodculture.com. Always remember to prove all things for yourself. Yahuwah God bless.